There is a country in East Africa with more than 100 million people, a rapidly growing economy, and one enormous problem. It has no coastline. Ethiopia is one of the world's largest landlocked countries, and for decades one port has dominated the country's international trade, Djibouti. But now, a challenger is emerging. Just across the Gulf of Aden sits Berbera, a port city in Somaliland that is being transformed into a modern trade gateway. A new road is pushing inland, a new economic zone is taking shape, and a major international logistics company is betting that Berbera can become more than just a regional port. It could become an alternative gateway to Ethiopia. But there is a problem. Djibouti has something Berbera doesn't have, a deeply established trade network connecting directly to Addis Ababa. So this isn't simply a story about two ports. It's a battle over something much bigger. Who controls the gateway to Ethiopia's economy? And the real question is, can Berbera actually challenge Djibouti, or is the gap still too large? To understand why Berbera matters, we first need to understand Ethiopia. Ethiopia has one of Africa's largest populations and one of the continent's most important economies. But geographically, it has a major disadvantage. It is landlocked. That means the factories producing goods in Ethiopia, the businesses importing machinery, the companies bringing in fuel, equipment and consumer products, and exporters trying to reach global markets, all depend on infrastructure beyond Ethiopia's borders. For years, the most important route has been through Djibouti, and this has created one of the most important economic relationships in the Horn of Africa. Ethiopia needs access to the sea. Djibouti needs Ethiopian trade, and between them is a corridor stretching from the port of Djibouti to Addis Ababa. According to World Bank analysis, the Djibouti corridor historically handled the overwhelming majority of Ethiopia's international trade. At one point, the World Bank estimated that roughly 95% of Ethiopian imports and exports were moving through Djibouti. That number tells us something important. Djibouti isn't simply another port Ethiopia can easily replace. It is deeply embedded into Ethiopia's logistics system. Djibouti's advantage isn't just geography, it's infrastructure. Over the years, Djibouti has developed an entire logistics ecosystem around Ethiopian trade. Ports, free zones, roads, warehouses, dry ports, and critically, a railway connecting Djibouti with Addis Ababa. The Djibouti-Addis Ababa Railway began commercial operations in 2018, dramatically reducing travel time compared to traditional road transport. That created something incredibly valuable in logistics: predictability. For a major importer, predictability matters. A container isn't valuable just because it reaches Ethiopia. It's valuable when a company knows approximately when it will arrive, how much it will cost, and whether the supply chain can be relied upon. Djibouti already has decades of commercial relationships, infrastructure, and logistics experience built around Ethiopia. That creates a powerful advantage, but also an opportunity. Because whenever one route becomes dominant, there is an incentive to build another. And this is where Berbera enters the story. Berbera sits on the southern coast of the Gulf of Aden. Its location is remarkable. It sits near one of the world's most important maritime trading regions. Ships moving between Asia, the Middle East, Africa and Europe pass through the wider Red Sea and Gulf of Aden system. For centuries, Berbera has been connected to regional commerce. But its modern transformation is different. The goal isn't simply to make Berbera a bigger port. The goal is to connect the port to an entire economic corridor, and that means one name keeps appearing: DP World. Since DP World became involved in Berbera's development, the port has undergone a major transformation. Modern container infrastructure has been built, and the first phase of expansion increased container capacity substantially. DP World's current plans envision even larger future capacity if subsequent expansion phases are completed. The port now features deep water infrastructure, container cranes, storage facilities, and connections to international shipping networks. But the most important part of the strategy may not be inside the port, it's outside it. Because a port without an efficient connection to the hinterland is just a collection of cranes beside the ocean. To compete for Ethiopian cargo, Berbera needs a corridor. The Berbera Corridor is designed to connect the port with Ethiopia. The route moves inland through Somaliland toward the Ethiopian border and onward toward Ethiopia's major markets. This changes the equation. Suddenly, Berbera isn't just competing as a port. It is competing as a system. Port, road, border crossing, warehousing, economic zone, distribution, and, eventually, potential industrial production. The strategy is straightforward. Bring goods through Berbera, move them across Somaliland, enter Ethiopia, and deliver them to one of Africa's largest markets. If that system becomes efficient enough, Ethiopian importers have another option, and that is exactly what Djibouti has to watch. But Berbera's ambitions go even further. Next to the port is the Berbera Economic Zone. The idea is to create an integrated maritime, logistics, and industrial hub. Instead of cargo simply arriving at the port and immediately leaving, businesses can store goods, process products, package goods, manufacture, trade, and distribute across the region. This is important because the most profitable ports don't simply move containers. They create economic activity around them. Think about what happens when a port attracts warehouses, then manufacturers, then transport companies, then financial services, then workers, then housing, then restaurants, then construction. The port becomes an economic engine, and Berbera is trying to build exactly that ecosystem. The Berbera Corridor is not just a railway line. It stands for a future of deeper regional ties, expanded trade possibilities, and fresh economic prospects. Whether these hopes will be realized is still uncertain. Yet one thing is certain: Africa's quest to create its next major trade artery is already underway. But here's where the story becomes much more complicated. Berbera has potential. Djibouti has scale. Berbera has a modernizing port. Djibouti has multiple established port and logistics facilities. Berbera has a developing corridor. Djibouti has a mature corridor supported by rail and road infrastructure. Berbera is trying to attract Ethiopian cargo. Djibouti already has the customers, and this is perhaps the biggest obstacle Berbera faces. Because changing a supply chain isn't easy. Imagine you're an Ethiopian company importing thousands of containers every year. You already know how Djibouti works. You have transport contracts, customs procedures, warehouses, freight forwarders, rail connections, trucking networks, insurance, banking relationships, and established routines. Why switch? Only if the alternative becomes sufficiently attractive. And that means Berbera has to compete on more than geography. It has to compete on cost, speed, and reliability. In global trade, geography matters. But logistics can matter even more. A port can be geographically closer and still lose if the total journey costs more. For Berbera to seriously challenge Djibouti, Ethiopian businesses need a reason to change. Maybe Berbera offers competitive port charges. Maybe the corridor becomes faster. Maybe customs procedures improve. Maybe transport costs fall. Maybe companies want a second gateway to reduce dependence on a single route. Or perhaps, all of these happen at the same time. That's when the competition becomes serious. For Ethiopia, this isn't necessarily about replacing Djibouti. It is about having options, and that distinction is critical. Imagine a country whose international trade depends heavily on one external corridor. That creates vulnerability. Any disruption, congestion, political disagreement, security crisis, or unexpected increase in logistics costs can affect the wider economy. Multiple gateways create flexibility, and Ethiopia has increasingly shown interest in diversifying its maritime access. Berbera is part of that broader strategy. It doesn't have to capture the majority of Ethiopian trade to become strategically important. Even a smaller share can change the negotiating position of the entire region. Because once there is competition, Everyone has an incentive to improve. And there is another reason this competition matters. The Gulf. The UAE has become deeply involved in logistics and infrastructure across the Red Sea and Horn of Africa. DP World's involvement in Berbera connects the city to a much larger international logistics network. This means Berbera isn't developing in isolation. It is being positioned within a broader commercial system stretching across the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, and East Africa. And that gives Berbera something it desperately needs: international connectivity. But it also raises the stakes, because ports in this region aren't merely economic assets. They are strategic assets. So what does Berbera have going for it? First, location. Berbera sits directly on the Gulf of Aden. Second, a modernizing port. Its infrastructure is far more capable than the old port that existed before its recent expansion. Third, an integrated economic zone. The objective is to connect trade, logistics, and industry. Fourth, Ethiopia. The enormous Ethiopian market is the prize. And fifth, competition itself. Ethiopia has an incentive to develop alternatives. That could create long-term demand for Berbera. Visual: Djibouti Port Railway, containers moving toward Addis Ababa, busy logistics facilities. Djibouti has an equally powerful list of advantages: established infrastructure, an operating railway, a mature logistics ecosystem, existing Ethiopian customers, established commercial relationships, and perhaps most importantly, inertia. Once a supply chain becomes established, it is difficult to displace. Djibouti doesn't need to prove that its system works. It already does. Berbera does. And that is why the competition could take years. Black screen. Text: Berbera vs Djibouti. Now let's ask the big question. Can Berbera defeat Djibouti? Probably not, at least not in the simple sense. But here's the more interesting possibility. It doesn't have to. Berbera doesn't need to replace Djibouti. It just needs to become a credible alternative. If Berbera captures a meaningful share of Ethiopian trade, if the corridor becomes faster and more reliable, if the economic zone attracts manufacturers and logistics companies, and if Ethiopia keeps diversifying its trade routes, then Berbera could fundamentally change the balance of power. Djibouti would still be a major gateway, but it would no longer be the only obvious gateway, and that changes everything. Because the real story here isn't about two ports. It is about the future of the Horn of Africa. A landlocked economic giant wants more access to global markets. A small coastal state wants to become a regional logistics hub. A neighboring country has built one of Africa's most important trade corridors, and international investors are positioning themselves around the region's ports, roads, and economic zones. The competition is already changing the map, and Ethiopia sits at the center of it. For decades, Ethiopia's route to the global economy ran overwhelmingly through Djibouti. Now another route is taking shape. Berbera may not replace Djibouti, but it could force Djibouti to compete. And for Ethiopia, that may be the entire point. Because in global trade, the most powerful position isn't always having the biggest port. Sometimes, it's having a choice. So the question isn't simply, will Berbera beat Djibouti? The real question is, what happens when Ethiopia no longer has to depend on just one gateway to the sea, Berbera versus Djibouti? The battle for Ethiopia's trade has only begun. What do you think? Can Berbera seriously challenge Djibouti, or will Djibouti remain Ethiopia's dominant gateway? Subscribe for more documentaries on Africa's ports, infrastructure, trade routes, and geopolitical transformation.